Hello, good afternoon guys. Right, for today's top OM606 tip, I've got some gold for you. Now, a few people ask on the internet and various forums, and even via email, I've rebuilt my OM606 engine and I'm struggling to build up oil pressure. People get a little bit worried if they can't immediately build up oil pressure when they start cranking it, or if the engine starts and it still has no oil pressure. Obviously that's not a situation we want. So I get asked, how do I get that oil pressure nice and quickly? I'm going to show you. So all you need to do is, the oil filter housing here, this is the 606 turbo type, will have a series of bolts in it that look like this. They're just a 6mm Allen key style. Take those out and then remove this housing. So completely take your oil filter housing off, and that will present to you the galleries in the block. Now remember, put your oil filter housing somewhere safe and clean whilst you do this. Make sure you've got something underneath the engine, because what we're going to do is we're going to crank the engine over without that oil filter housing on. Now, frustratingly, I've already done this, so it took maybe 5 seconds of cranking to get the oil out, but I'm going to show you what happens. So we're looking at here, and this port here, this one here, is the one that we want to be looking at. Let me just wipe the oil out of there so you can see how nice and clean that engine is. Right, you ready? There we go. And as soon as that happens, as soon as you get that oil coming out of there, that's it, bled up. And don't waste any time putting that oil filter housing back on, because we don't want to get any contaminants or grit or anything like that in that housing. That wants to go straight back on. But literally, you put that housing back on with your new filter in and everything, and your 2 oil cooler hoses that will go on the side, these ones, and that's it. That's your oil system prime. I'd further add to this oil pump education by telling you the direction of flow of the oil through the system. So as you can see, there's a few bits going on here and in the way, but this is a rear sump system, oil pump being at the front of the sump. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the rear oil pump system, but they're an interesting pump because they have a pump built into the rear sump that just pumps oil from the front to the back, which is interesting. But moving on from that. So what happens is the oil pump pumps the oil, it goes up into the engine block, into a capillary, basically a long drilling that goes all the way along the block, right? And then it goes to the hole that I've just shown you, the sort of the big round hole. And then when it comes out of that big round hole, it pushes into this section of the oil filter housing. Now that then goes straight into the lower oil cooler pipe. That goes down into the oil cooler, and then it comes back again, and then it feeds into the oil filter housing itself. So from the pump through the capillary, through the oil cooler, and then to the filter housing itself. And you can see the discharge port, and I'll show you this. I'll just spin the engine over. Are you ready? Now that is the oil coming back from that oil cooler. Now the sections that you can see here obviously have the outer ring and like an inner ring. The outer ring obviously pushes through the outside of this filter, which catches all the debris, and then it passes through to the inner core and then goes down through the middle and then into the actual engine, and it feeds then the bearings and all the other bits. So it shows how important it is that your oil cooler pipes are sound, because obviously if you have a broken one of those, the oil ain't going to get from the oil pump to your filter housing and then into your bearings. So always make sure that they're in tip-top condition, otherwise it's game over for your bearings. Now, to show you how quickly you can build up oil pressure if you've done what I've just said, this is a fully rebuilt engine. That oil pump had obviously some oil from it being rebuilt, but it wasn't primed. You saw me crank it and prime it out of that hole. I've just filled that, put that filter housing on and filled it. Now I'm going to show you how quickly you will gain oil pressure. Now bearing in mind it has to go all the way through the oil cooler, fill up this as well, before it can actually pressurise the bearings. So, you ready? Let's have a look then. So I'm going to turn it on. This is the oil pressure gauge. The second the oil pressure gauge senses any pressure, it will drop to 0. Right, so are we ready? Make sure your oil cooler lines are on. Yep, they're on. That will be filling the housing. There we go. So that you've just seen, as soon as it flicked to the 0 mark, that means it's starting to register oil pressure. So that means that we actually have, I've put the oil pressure gauge on my stand just on the oil cooler return line, because then it's showing me that it's going from the oil cooler and back again, and then it has to build up pressure against the backside, you know, against the actual bearings, and make sure that's all primed before it will actually show pressure on here. So now I'm going to hook all the rest of the bits and pieces up. Now I know I've got some oil pressure. I'm going to put the glow plugs, I'm going to put the water cooling pipes on, the cooling in. I'm going to put the glow plug loom on, and then I'm going to put the coolant in, and then I'm going to start it up, and you can see the oil pressure. To conclude this little oil pressure education, I'm going to start this engine up, and you can see what the oil pressure is. This engine's already warm. I've done a few heat cycles with it, and there's one other thing I want to show you as well. So if you come down to the oil filter housing, you might be wanting to put an aftermarket gauge in. Now, one thing you may or may not know about a 606 engine is that they don't have an oil pressure gauge from the factory. They have no method of measuring the oil pressure in the engine. They do have an oil level in the sump to tell you if it's low, but they don't have anything that measures oil pressure, nothing at all. So, it's not a problem, you can very easily measure it. This little port here, and that is an M12 by 1.5, which looks like that. This is actually an anti-jerk line that I keep on the stand for testing the anti-jerk for leaks. And then in the back here, that is an M10 by 1.5. I think it's 1.5. I know it's M10, I think it's 1.5. And you can take oil pressure from either one of those 2 points, or like I have, I've taken oil pressure from the line, but that's not going to be as easy for you unless you're going to weld a fitting on like I did. Okay, so let's see what the oil pressure is. So this is, like I say, a warm engine. Won't have to wait very long for the glow plugs. It's probably like, what, 20 degrees today? So that is at idle. The idle speed is not 3000, the idle speed is about 750. Ignore this. This is reading directly off the W wire. Come round. It's reading directly off the W wire of the alternator. And there's no conversion in between. That rev counter's designed for like a Chevy V8 and that kind of thing. It's like an aftermarket thing. So you always get readings like this. So yeah, as you can see, the oil pressure at idle is just below 20 psi, and that is a hot engine. So as I rev it up, look, you can see, so I'm about 40 psi at maybe just under 2,000 revs, maybe just under 2,000, and then if we give it a blip, we see about a maximum of 60 psi. Right, just to repeat what I've just said in case you didn't hear it. So at idle we had around 20 psi, about 2,000 RPM we were getting around 40, and then if I revved it up, it maxed out around 60 psi. When it's cold, you're going to see potentially a little bit more. The oil that I've got in this one is 5W40 semi-synthetic. Now, I am using semi-synthetic in the engine to run it in. I would always recommend a fully synthetic in your actual completed build or engine. Semi-synthetic, good for running in because it's not as good for lubricating. Fully synthetic when it's running to keep that engine in good condition. And 5W40 is my preferred version. 5W30 is too thin. I don't really like that. And going any thicker than that is too heavy. It's for worn out engines. So yeah, I think 5W40 is a nice sweet spot. 10W40 probably could as well. So there you go, little bit on oil priming and oil pressure and how the circuit works briefly. The basic setup, the primary side of the circuit before the filter works. Maybe at a later date we'll discuss the post filter side. Bye for now.